Yannick Pizunka. Welcome to the INSEAD webinar, Between the Lines. Today, it's a great pleasure to actually welcome Jeff Pfeffer from Stanford University. Jeff, if you're with us, it would be great if you could join us, activate your video and your microphone. Wonderful. Good to see you. Hey, Jeff.
It's nice to be seen.
Welcome to everybody. I'm blown away. We have more than 500 people. More than 500 people joining us for this session live. A few words about Jeff and about the book. Jeff has been at Stanford Business School since 1979. Without giving away too much, this has been my birth date. I've been born in 1979. This is how long Jeff has been teaching at Stanford Business School. He's an absolute superstar at Stanford and far beyond. And one thing I would like to point out, which I think is very not unique, but very specific and extraordinary. Jeff has been a superstar in research. He has created the field of resource dependency. He has written multiple kind of key papers in that field, has written the book with his late colleague, Jerry Slanchik. It's been a fantastic book. My dissertation is to a large degree based on that very book. So I'm not just kind of doing the talk, I'm actually walking the walk here. I've read the book multiple times, have kind of dig really deeply. Beyond that, beyond being an academic superstar, Jeff has been incredibly relevant in practice, right? You see, the fact that we have by now 700 people joining really kind of speaks not only to his kind of appeal, but also to his staying power, right? To be relevant since 1979, right, is really saying something. I remember we actually had a conversation when I got my PhD at Stanford, and we were hoping that Jeff would teach a PhD class. And at some point, we actually talked with the dean about whether this would be a possibility. And he said, like, no, he's completely oversubscribed already by demand from the MBAs and executives. He has no time whatsoever to teach anything else, give up. And so this really kind of shows you kind of the relevance, the impact he had. Let me say a word on the book. The book we're going to talk about is 7 Rules of Power, Surprising but True Advice on How to Get Things Done and Advance Your Career. This is Jeff's 16th book, okay? I have read 5 books, or at least 5 books of Jeff. I've read your books with Bob Sutton, The Knowing Doing Gap, the Dying for a Paycheck, the first kind of the multiple books on power. And you know, initially when I started reading this book, I was like, oh my God, you know, haven't I heard these anecdotes? And I was proven so wrong. It is so worth reading this book, even if you've read other books of Jeff. There's new material and there are new insights. And I think also the pedagogy has improved enormously. You can tell that kind of Jeff has continued to teach this material. You can really see how he's gotten kind of more and more advanced in kind of learning how to present this research. I had great fun reading this book. I learned a lot. I was kind of agitated. I sometimes wanted to disagree, even when he was right. So I was emotionally involved. I will admit, I'm not going to go into detail in this. Please read the very last chapter if you buy the book. I ended up crying because you're in this mental state when you're like, oh, this is all about power and this is what really counts, and you're really kind of geared up. And then you read a little bit about Jeff's life in recent years, and I tears were coming in my case. I was honestly moved. So Jeff, thank you so much for joining. Thank you so much for this book and the experiences that came with it.
Well, it's a pleasure to be with you, and I always try to take whatever opportunity I can to spread knowledge and wisdom, particularly in a field like power and leadership. Because there is, as you know, I wrote a book called Leadership BS, and BS does not stand for Bachelor of Science. There is so much bad information out there, and there are so many students and ex-students and people who I know, executives, who are having career troubles because they are acting on the basis, not of social science, but on the basis of what they wish were true or something else. So I'm always happy, and I'm honored to be joined by so many people, and I'm honored, Henning, that you reached out.
Jeff, you start out and say, like, look, it's important to understand that power is a tool, and I really like this analogy. Can you elaborate a little bit this? Why is power a tool, and how to think about it as a tool?
Yeah, well, so I think many people say, you know, they see power as being used for bad purposes. You know, they see corruption in both the public and the private sector. They see people doing bad things. They see people harming others. They see war and pestilence and everything else, oftentimes driven by people who do not suffer the consequences of their actions. By the way, this is also true of CEOs who lay people off, but they never lay themselves off. So, you know, and they see power being used for ill, and they say, I want nothing to do with it. I don't want to have power. But of course, if you want to, Stanford has a motto, our business school has a motto: change lives, change organizations, change the world. And if you're going to change lives or organizations or the world, you're going to need influence, because if change were going to happen easily, it would have happened already. So you cannot really run away from power. Power is part of social life. Power is part of interpersonal dynamics. And so when you see it as a tool, you can see it can be used for good, which it is. And I try to provide a number of examples of that in the book. It can be used for evil, but it is just a tool. And in that sense, you ought to approach the power as you would approach the study of any other tool, in kind of a value neutral way.
Jeff, you've taught this material for a long time, and one thing that you do early on in the book, which I found incredibly interesting, is that you portray a little bit the learning journey that people go through when they learn about power, and you talk about like the phase of denial. And can you elaborate a little bit on what are these phases in learning about power? What does one go through when one learns about power?
Sure. So I, you know, as I've taught this material, I see people now, fewer people in my class, because the class has been taught for a long time. We have an enormous waiting list. And so therefore, there's a little bit less of this, some of the early stages. But no, I think the first thing people do is they say, this doesn't apply to me. It doesn't apply in my particular culture. It doesn't apply in my particular organization. It doesn't apply, you know, to people in startups or in my industry or whatever. And that is all an example of trying to deny the reality of the social science that we are going to talk about. And so denial is first. Denial is often followed by anger. How can you say these things? How can you use these examples? Because many of the people I bring in as visitors to my class, many of the examples in 7 Rules of Power are not necessarily people that you want to emulate. I have on my bookshelf, which I can see from where I'm sitting, a book called Raven. It was given to me by a now deceased journalist who was the chief political reporter for the McClatchy newspapers. He finished the book when his colleague, Tim Reiterman, was injured, actually injured on the runway at Guyana and Jonestown. The book is about Jim Jones, the man who was the originator of the thing, drink the Kool-Aid, because he killed 900 people when they drank poison-laced Kool-Aid in the jungles of South America. And, you know, and his inscription to me by John Jacobs said, you know, basically, you know, this guy did everything you taught, which is exactly correct. So I use Jim Jones as an example of 7 Rules of Power. So anger. How can you talk about these people? How can you talk about Donald Trump? I just did a LinkedIn post on Trump the other day. How can you do these things? Anger. So denial first, then comes anger, then comes sadness. Oh my God, you're really right. You worn me down with too much social science and too many examples. And now I'm sad, because this is not a world that looks like the world that I would like it to be. And finally, if we are successful, which we often are, because I use a bunch of fabulous executive coaches whose names I would make available to anybody if you send me an email. I use a set of executive coaches to work with the students. And if we are successful, we finally reach acceptance. And acceptance is, this is the way the world is. I'm going to take these tools, which is the word Henning began with. I'm going to take these tools and I'm going to use them to accomplish amazing things. I'm going to start as I do a Pfeffer on Power podcast. One of my examples was a relatively recent graduate, an Indian-American guy who started a battery company. One of these examples, one of the Pfeffer on Power podcasts covers Dr. Sarah Boop, a recent Stanford MBA graduate who has started a company in the construction industry. And by the way, there are not many women in the construction industry. She will go to enormous construction conferences and be often the only woman. So I I see people doing amazing things with these tools once they get to the point of acceptance and they say, this is it. I'm going to take these ideas and use them to advance my career and also to make things happen.
So, Jeff, you kind of preempted me on here. I wanted to kind of follow one of your rules, kind of let other people talk about your qualities. I wanted to plug the Pfeffer on Power podcast later on. This is something I can fully endorse. This is not an empty endorsement. I listened to every single episode. There was a time, I think, when you interrupted it for a few months, and I was dearly hoping that you continue it. So it's a fantastic podcast. You gain a lot of the insights from the book and far beyond. You hear from interesting people and their kind of journeys in their career. So if you have time, subscribe to the Pfeffer on Power podcast.
And if I can interject, one of the things that I am proudest about of this podcast is that we have African Americans, we have women, we have Southeast Asians. That this is not just a bunch of old white men. That this is people. These are relatively recent graduates. These are more senior people. My friend Gary Loveman, who went on to become CEO of Caesars, and then a senior executive of the health insurance company Aetna. So we have a very diverse, in every respect of the word diversity, by gender, by race, by ethnicity. We did a podcast on a former student of mine who started a payment startup in Tanzania, in Africa, who I think one day may become president of Tanzania, who knows? So I'm very pleased with the diversity of the people who have appeared on this podcast and be willing to share their stories.
Jeff, say a word more about this, because you make this point early on in the book that you raised the question, is this a book for white men? And you're kind of, say a little bit more about how relevant this material is for whom and in what ways.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I went out during COVID. I remember this well because I was afraid I was going to get COVID. I went out to lunch with about 6 or 7 MBA students who, by the way, were all men. They were all white. And then not all of them, by the way, were in my class. I will often go out to dinner or lunch with students from my class, but some of these people were not in my class. And so we talked at lunch. I remember the restaurant. I remember the meal. We talked at lunch about the fact that some of the people were not in my class. And they said, look, we don't need this. We are going to succeed anyway. The people who need this class, we had a very explicit discussion about the fact that over the years, the proportion of minorities and women and people from various kinds of backgrounds that do not necessarily make them central in the power structure are taking the class. And those are exactly the people who need it the most. I mean, if you're the child of some wealthy human being, so you're going to succeed, as one of my friends describes it, if you're part of the lucky gene club or something, you don't really need to know how to succeed, because you're going to succeed because of the advantages that you've been given by life and by the world and by an accident of birth. The people who actually need this the most are, in fact, the people who are more on the other or on the outs or whatever. I think so. So this is a book. We have a session in the class on women in power. We have a session in the class for the alumni, and and so often we will have various people from disadvantaged groups come. And yeah, so I think this is a book that is useful for everybody, but it is particularly useful if you need to learn the secrets of success, because you are not going to succeed just because of your parents.
Jeff, let's dive a little bit into the 7 rules of power you're kind of deriving from your body of work. And it starts out with get out of your own way. What does that mean? How does this help me?
Yeah, well, I think many of our listeners, and we're now up to 1,100, which I'm amazed by. This is, by the way, Henning, you've done a great job, because this is the largest audience I've ever had. I feel very honored. And anyway, I think most of this audience will understand at least the phrase or the reality of the phrase imposter syndrome, where people believe that they are at Stanford the admissions mistake, or at INSEAD the admissions mistake. They have been promoted by some accident, and that they don't deserve the job or the role that they are in.
And so I think one of the ways in which you need to get out of your own way is to stop thinking of yourself as some imposter and think of yourself as, in fact, who you are, somebody immensely qualified and deserving of the role in which you're put. So that's one way in which you need to get out of your own way. Another way in which you need to get out of your own way is you need to lose the tendency to engage in preemptive apology. So students will raise their hand and say, you know, I'm not sure if this comment is going to be good, or people will say, I'm not sure if this is going to be a useful question, or, you know, they engage in what I would call preemptive apology. They basically, in a variety of ways, deprecate their power and deprecate their insight, you know, and so I sometimes will push back on them. So by the end of the quarter, they're not doing that by saying, you know, if you're not sure that the comment is going to add anything, why are you making it? And of course, they smile and they understand that, you know, that I'm pushing back so that they do not describe themselves in ways that disempower them. So I think that's a second way in which we get in our own way. A third way in which we get in our own way is we desire too much to be liked. Now, likability is a good quality. I believe in being liked. I try to be liked and likable. I do believe in my friend Bob Sutton's famous book, The No Asshole Rule. I think that's exactly right. But you can optimize for being effective, or you can optimize for being likable. And oftentimes being effective and being liked involves a certain amount of trade-off. And no one is hired into a senior role because they've won some popularity contest or because they're going to be the nicest human being in the room. People are hired into senior roles because they are given a responsibility to get things done and to make things happen, to change strategy, to change the course of the organization. You know, I see these reviews. You know, I'm now kind of, because of my age, an expert in finding doctors. Actually, it's the number one thing that my colleagues ask me about is who's the best doctor for one specialty or another. You know, when you go to a doctor, you know, you don't evaluate the doctor by the quality of the waiting room or even by whether or not you think the doctor is charming. You know, as I said to somebody when I had microsurgery on my lower back, you know, I mean, you know, this man could paralyze you if he does something wrong. You know, I really don't care about his personality. I care about his technical skills. And that is true for people in leadership roles as well. You are hired into senior leadership roles to get things done. So you want to make sure that you are effective, not just like. So I would say, see, these are all examples of ways in which we get in our own way.
Bob Sutton, your friend and co-author and a former guest of the webinar series, I remember he has these kind of 11 rules or so where he says like passion is overestimated, and he uses the doctor as an example, I believe, at some point. He said like, look, it's great to have a passionate doctor, but I'd rather have a competent doctor, right? Like if the person is not passionate about it, it's just a professional, that is what really matters. So kind of to be, how to say, to be careful about the criteria you are using when you're evaluating others or when you're evaluating yourself is a very important thing. Jeff, you then come to this very kind of, I mean, one thing which makes your writing just so compelling is that I feel like you make an effort to be controversial, and it really works and it sticks, right? So you call the second rule, break the rules. Look, we obviously kind of teach students, we teach children that very often it's about kind of respecting the rules. So say a little bit about how you need to break the rules to be successful, and also about when to break them, how to break them. Yeah, give a little bit more richness to that provocative phrase.
Okay, I actually don't think it's that provocative because there is, of course, a ton of research, including a famous article done by some Dutch social scientists entitled Breaking the Rules to Rise to Power. If you think about, we'll take it out of the personal thing and put it in the strategic sense. If I said to you, Henning, I'm going to go into business by making a personal computer, and it's going to be black and it's going to use Windows, you know, you would say you're not going to have very high margins because you're doing what a billion other people can also do. So if you think about strategy, oftentimes the most successful organizations are the most successful people are those that have defied conventional wisdom. Steve Jobs and Apple are a fabulous example of that. in terms of inventing products that no one had thought of before, and emphasizing design and doing all kinds of interesting things. I think you can see other examples of this, such as John Mackey of Whole Foods, which is now owned by Amazon, Southwest Airlines. If you think about it, Elon Musk, I mean, should you be actually trying to go to Mars? Probably not. The invention of the promulgation of the electric car was certainly that was unconventional. I mean, at the time he launched Tesla, we had hybrids, but nobody was doing really fully electric. Could you find battery technologies? So certainly in the area of strategy, you see companies that are the most successful are those that are able to differentiate themselves. And I think that's true for people as well. The rules are made by the people in power, and therefore there are rules that favor the people in power. I would point out that Nelson Mandela became the father of South Africa while he was in jail. So not only he defied the rules, he defied the laws of apartheid in South Africa. Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail was written while he was in jail. So the whole civil rights movement in the South of the United States to provide African Americans the rights, and including the right to vote, that they had been so long denied, involved people engaging in not only breaking the rules, but breaking the law, engaging in civil disobedience, in sitting in. Today, as we are discussing this important topic, there are people all over the United States doing sit-ins. Commencement has been canceled in some of the major universities in the United States because of demonstrations, in some cases pro-Palestinian demonstrations, in some cases pro-Israeli demonstrations. The Vietnam War was, of course, filled with student demonstrations. So that, if you want to change things, you have to be willing to do things that defy conventional wisdom and that are oftentimes involve rule breaking. One of the rules that I think people really need to break is there is this assumption that we are supposed to be self-sufficient. So we are not supposed to ask people for help. We are not supposed to ask for things. My friend Francis Flynn, and Vanessa Lake wrote a fabulous article entitled, "If You Need Help, Just Ask." And they point out that many people that agreed to participate in their studies, but were so uncomfortable about asking for help. Can I borrow your cell phone? Will you show me how to get to the Columbia University gymnasium? Will you help me by answering this questionnaire so I can pre-test it? People were so uncomfortable in asking for help that an enormous percentage of them refused to continue with the experiment, even though they had signed up. And so I think, we need to ask for more things. We definitely need to ask for more things, and we need to be willing to defy conventional wisdom. We need to be bolder. And I used to believe that what my class was about is teaching people social science. I actually don't think that's its biggest effect. I obviously teach people a lot of social science, but I think the biggest effect of my class on the students and why it's so popular is I get students to be bolder, to do things that they didn't think they could do, to ask for things that they didn't think they could ask for, to try to accomplish things that they did not think they could accomplish. And, I don't know if you can invent an electric car company just by wishing that it were so, but I can tell you, if you do not try, you will never succeed.
It's funny, Jeff. I used to teach a doctoral seminar in Munich, and the question I got most often is, how do you get into Stanford University as a PhD student? And I always asked back the question, who of you has applied? And not a single hand went up. And I said, well, there has not anybody ever accepted in the Stanford PhD program who has applied. I applied, it worked out. I can't tell you anymore, but that is a necessary condition. You pointed out the boldness.
By the way, I think that's a fabulous example. I mean, you don't ask. My late wife, who you referred to indirectly as you described the acknowledgement section of Seven Rules of Power, it looked like absolutely gorgeous. Her name is Kathleen Fowler. If you go on Forever Missed Kathleen Fowler, which is a website, you can see pictures of her. Somebody said to me, how did you ever get this gorgeous woman to go out with you? I said, well, I asked her. You know, nobody has ever gone on a date if they haven't been asked. Nobody's ever gotten into a doctoral program if they haven't applied. And no one gets a job that they don't ask for. So you are completely correct.
You point out this kind of effect of being more bold. And this is part of the third rule, show up in a powerful fashion, Jeff. How do people show up in a powerful fashion?
I have a colleague named Dana Carney. Dana is a professor in the Haas School at UC Berkeley, and she's writing a book entitled Tell. But you don't have to wait for the book to come out. Dana Carney, Carney, has written an article in the California Management Review, and she's also written a more academic article, so you can look her up at scholar.google.com. And she talks about the importance of body language. And that's one of the ways in which we show up with power. What is your posture? Amy Cuddy has this extraordinarily popular TED Talk based on her book, Presence. I think the second most watched TED Talk in history. I would tell everybody watching this podcast or this webinar to look at Amy Cuddy and follow her rules. My colleague, Deborah Grunfeld, has written a book called Acting with Power. And she also has some material on YouTube. Go look up Deborah Grunfeld and look at her thing. So a lot about acting with power is about posture, body language, voice, expression, using powerful language. And we need to show up with power. There is absolutely no question that we respond subliminally. There's a aphorism, I can't actually find the research behind this, that says you respond to people 50% by how they look, 40% by how they sound, and only by 10% by the content of what they say. You know, I think that's right. There's research. Cameron Anderson at UC Berkeley has done a fabulous study showing that confidence is often confused with competence. Even when people know that certain people are more competent than others, they respond in terms of their ratings, in terms of confidence, not necessarily competence. So how you show up, how you talk, the body language that you use are all important elements of having people take you seriously.
Jeff, kind of referring back to the body language, one of the questions we got in the Q&A, and please kind of continue to keep on posting questions, was how do you actually build power remotely? Because that feels like a somewhat of a different ball game, or you need to at least kind of adjust in certain ways. So a lot of people kind of working to large scale remotely these days. How do you build power in a remote kind of working environment?
Well, I think you would use the same kind of thing. So when I teach acting and speaking with power, I use as an example video of Tony Hayward, the former CEO of BP, and Lloyd Blankfein, the now retired CEO of Goldman Sachs, testifying in front of Congress. And while they are testifying in live session, the video that the students are seeing is obviously video, it's Zoom. And so you can have a stronger voice on video. You can use forceful gestures on video. You can make or not make eye contact on video by trying to remember to look at the camera, something I'm not so perfect at myself. So you can, so the idea of eye contact, which is important, because if you don't make eye contact, people think you're not honest or you're not, you don't know what you're talking about. I think all of these things you can do on video. One of the things that hurts Tony Hayward when he testifies in front of Congress about the oil spill is he reads. And reading, of course, keeps you from making eye contact because you're looking down, and reading suggests that you're scripted, and reading suggests that you don't know what you're talking about. So I think eye contact, voice, and forceful gestures are something that you can do in any meeting.
Jeff, one question which comes up continuously in the questions here is, and I didn't see this in the book, you don't actually provide a formal definition of power, if I'm not mistaken. And I personally actually like that. I think it's always like, oh, you know, like lots of books about organizations start with a definition of organization, and then we feel like, great, we got another one. So why, but can you kind of place this a little bit? How is power different from influence? How is it different from competence and charisma? Can you kind of help us to contextualize or differentiate the concept a bit?
Sure. So I define power as the ability to get your way in opposition, against opposition. So so if I hold a book up above the floor and let it go, the force of gravity is going to take it down. I don't need any power to get the book to fall. Gravity is going to do it. But in organizations, there are often disagreements because where you stand depends upon where you sit. So if I'm in marketing, I see things through a marketing perspective. If I'm an engineer, I see things through an engineering perspective. If I'm in finance, I will see things from a financial perspective. And these perspectives will often differ. So disagreement is a fundamental part of organizational life. People are going to see things differently. Their key performance indicators are going to be different. And so they're going to want different things, and they're going to have different points of view. And so power is your ability to get more of your way. It is related in that sense to negotiation. So my colleague, Maggie Neal, who's now retired, moved to Texas, has written books on negotiation, and she describes negotiation as the ability to get more of what you want. I think that is power permits you to get more of what you want. And if you think about it, we live in a world that is hierarchical. There's only one president of France. There's only one director or CEO of INSEAD. There's only one dean of Stanford Business School, who, by the way, was just named president of Stanford University. There's only one president of the United States. There are many more positions on the bottom than at the top. And so therefore, people are going to be in competition. They're going to be in competition for their ideas. They're going to be in competition for promotions. They're going to be in competition. And power permits you to win in these competitions. And power permits you to, to have your views prevail. You know, to take a very prosaic example, if you are in a relationship with a significant other, your taste in movies may not be exactly what the significant other's views in movies are. So when it comes time to say we're going to go to a movie or going to watch a streaming video on the weekend, the question is whose view is going to prevail. So power is the ability to get your way. Charisma may be a source of power. Many people see that as so there's sources of power. They're different than having power. Power is potential. So I can have power and not use it. Influence is power and use. That's how I would distinguish power from influence.
If there's one thing, and this goes back to a few things you say, there's a quote by Peter Thiel. Like, I'm not going to give the quote verbatim, but one thing I always liked a lot what he said. He said, like, look, monopolies are incredibly hard to detect because people who have a monopoly try everything that people don't see it, and people who don't have a monopoly try everything that people think they have a monopoly. And he gives this beautiful example that he says, like, Google claims every single day that they don't have a monopoly. But they would say, like, oh, of the overall advertising market, we just have 6% because they're magazines and newspapers and what do I not know. By contrast, a local pizza shop would say, oh, we are the only pizza shop which has these kind of crust or something like that. And the reason I mention it is because obviously monopolies are about power, and it feels like power is a little bit like that. People in powerful positions would not openly talk about the need to have power, the need to compete, right? And so it's almost hard to detect it's important. Is that a fair kind of assessment, which makes it hard to learn about it?
So Moses Naim, N-A-I-M, wrote a book some years ago called The End of Power, in which he interviewed a bunch of powerful people, and they claimed that they weren't powerful. So that is consistent with your view. However, because power becomes very much a self-fulfilling prophecy, most people in power will act as if they have power in a variety of ways. So I'm not 100% sure that people in power will not act like they have power. Oftentimes, they will act like they have more power than they have because people, my colleague and friend Robert Cialdini, many years ago wrote this famous study, co-authored, entitled Basking in Reflected Glory, and pointed out that people like to be associated with success. And people like, I think, people do like to be associated with success. Well, Don Quixote is a wonderful figure in literature. If I say to you, Henning, you're in a quixotic quest, it's not considered to be a compliment. So I think people want to be associated with organizations that succeed. People want to be associated with others who they think are powerful and going to succeed. And so therefore, power has a self-fulfilling property to it that so the many powerful people, in fact, are willing to show their power.
You see, Jeff, I very much agree with this. I think my comment was more built on some of the questions in the Q&A. Very often when you have a guest speaker in class, at least this happens to me, that somebody would say like, oh, I was just very competent. I worked extremely hard. I was emotionally intelligent. So when people kind of tell their story, so to speak, they do not necessarily refer to a power play, which makes it kind of, to a certain degree, you underestimate the role of power because people would not openly talk about it in that sense, right?
I think that's exactly right. So one of the things that I think people need to be careful about. So we have a series at Stanford, which is, I think, something that most business schools do. We have these people come in at Stanford. It's called View from the Top. I never go to see View from the Top because if I want to see fiction, I might as well read Moby Dick. So people come in, and they have been carefully prepared by their PR people to tell you all kinds of things, most of which, of course, are not true. So yes, I think your caution, I think, is very, very, very well taken. That you ought to, if I want to understand how, various people have risen to their positions, the last thing I'm going to do is ask them. I'm going to ask the people who watch what they've done.
I remember, I believe this is the first talk I ever saw of you. And you made a statement, this is like probably 20 years ago, but it really stuck with me. When you said like, hey, if you want to learn how to kind of have a career, don't look at the smart, beautiful people. Look at the dumb, ugly people who made it to the top because they must have done something you can actually learn from. And I always thought it like just from like a statistical standpoint, right? It's like so interesting. You say like, let's control all this other stuff and then kind of look at because they must have something going for them. I would like to come to the fourth rule, Jeff. Create a powerful brand. Say a word about that. I mean, you're obviously a master on that, right? You see, like, if I hear Jeff Pfeffer, it's very difficult at this point not to think of power, right? It's almost like a word embedding pair, which always goes together. I think if I enter Jeff Pfeffer into ChatGPT, power is the next word that's going to pop up in the autocomplete. But so say a word about what it takes to kind of build a powerful brand, why it is so important.
Well, I think, it goes back to my comment about competition. Why do soft drinks build brands or, drug companies or auto companies? And they build brands so that when people think of an automobile, they think of a particular company, or they think of a soft drink or a Band-Aid or a pharmaceutical product, they think of a particular product. No one has ever been promoted to a job if they were not noticed. It is necessary but insufficient for you to get a promotion for somebody to know of your existence. And so therefore you have to do something. This goes back kind of to breaking the rules, but it's a little bit different, to stand out and to stand for something and not only to have a set of skills and a set of accomplishments, which are obviously important, but you have to understand that your boss and your boss's boss and your boss's boss's boss are busy with their own jobs and their own careers. And so therefore, they are not necessarily going to know everything that you have done. They are not necessarily going to know all of your accomplishments. They're not going to know all of your skills and abilities. And so it is incumbent on you to figure out how they can know what you've done and what you've accomplished. And, I will tell you a very, very, very funny story. I teach an online version of my power class in the LEAD program. This is a multi-course online learning program run by Stanford. So we have a thing called Meet a We, in which many participants from the LEAD program who have done all these online classes come to the Stanford campus for 2 or 3 days. And my elective is the most popular elective. And so they come and they all want to see me and they want to bring a book and get the book autographed. And one year, our dean came to Meet a We, and I made sure that I stood near him so that when all these students formed this huge line to get their book signed, the dean would notice. You know, that's a simple little thing so that he would see how many people, and he would, you know, not that I needed to see that because he already kind of appreciated me, but, you know, I mean, you need to do things so that people know what you've done and what you've accomplished and what you stand for. And so you need to think about, how do you want to be known? I'm known, I think, and you've already kind of alluded to this several times, as an unconventional thinker. I'm known I think more than being associated with power, I'm associated with being a disruptor, you know, and telling truth to power or whatever. In any event, you want to build a brand that serves you and that is going to help you stand out in a world in which there are, you know, hundreds of, actually not hundreds, of thousands of people getting MBA degrees every year from Stanford and INSEAD and London Business School, all these places. And so you need to do something to stand out. You need to tell your story so that, because if you don't tell your story, other people will not.
Jeff, in how important is it when people tell their story? You see, like, how should I say, you see, like, so I got my PhD with Kathy Eisenhart, who you know very well. And Kathy always had this saying, like, be careful not just to be famous. You need to be famous for something. And she referred explicitly to the academic job market. And I wonder if you could kind of elaborate a little bit on this, right? You see, there's one thing to kind of post on LinkedIn all the time and stuff like that. Like, give me this kind of, how do people figure out what they want to be known for? Kind of, you see, like, before I tell the whole world, there's a famous story that Nike at some point tried to actually sign Boris Becker, the German tennis player. And they said, like, we figure out what you're about, and then we tell the whole world about it. And he responded, I don't even know myself what I'm about. And so how important is it to have a clear message in this? Is this more about, like, oh, I've done this, or is it important to have a very clear, strong profile?
No, I think it's a very good question. You need to be known for something. That is Kathy Eisenhart, who, by the way, I served on her thesis committee. I think that is exactly correct. So one of the things that I would suggest that the students do, or the listeners do, is in fact to do what I do. You know, I mean, I'm happy to send my course outline to anybody. One of the things I do with the students is I have them actually try to create a brand statement for themselves. It's one of the exercises I have. What do you want to be known for? How do you want to describe yourself? What about your life and your trajectory? Not your resume. What about your life and your trajectory makes you particularly well suited to do the job that you're applying for or to do the job that you're doing? Tell me how you have gotten to be where you are in terms of, you know, your life experience and your learning and many people have, you know, tell very compelling stories about how they have gotten to where they are and how what they're doing fits their life experience. Jeff Jordan, who is a partner in Andreessen Horowitz, a venture capital firm, says, we like to fund people who have a life history that makes them particularly suited for the startup that they're trying to get off the ground. You know, so they funded my friend Tristan Walker, who's an African-American man who started a company called Walker & Company Brands, which is to make grooming products for the underserved minority population in the US. And he was well suited to do that because he was himself a Black man. He understood the issue of razor bumps and single versus double-bladed shaving, etc. And so you want to, and I think Jeff Jordan is right, that you want to find someone who's obviously smart and who's obviously got experience, but whose career and what he's trying or she is trying to do is particularly well suited to their own life experience. And so and the way to figure this out is to write a brand statement. It will probably be too long. Get feedback from coaches, executive coaches, or get feedback from your peers, and over time refine the brand statement. I think this is true for companies. I think it's true for individuals.
Jeff, people are, by the way, I should say one thing. People are asking a lot of questions about who you refer to. What I would do following this is that in a few weeks, when we have the video recording edited and stuff like this, I will put up a LinkedIn post. I will link to all the people you have mentioned and kind of their books and podcasts and stuff like this. I make sure we include a link to your podcast and so on. Let's come to the next rule. 5, network relentlessly. Say a word about that. We all know about the importance of networking. How to do it? Why is it so important? Yeah.
So if management is about getting things done through other people, it strikes me as being almost intuitively obvious that the more people you know, the more you'll be able to get done. People, I think, see networking as something dirty or something, ugly or whatever. But networking is simply helping people who could benefit by being connected to each other actually make those connections. So if you think about it, what does a venture capitalist do? A venture capitalist links people with business ideas or technologies with people with money to invest. What does a real estate broker do? A real estate broker links buyers and sellers of houses. What does an investment banker do? Connects people trying to sell businesses with people trying to buy them, or people who need to raise capital with people with capital to invest. So there are many, many jobs in life which are explicitly around brokerage. There are other jobs, however, that aren't explicitly about brokerage, where you can nonetheless gain benefits from putting people or groups of people together who could, in fact, benefit from knowing each other. And so the idea of networking is about being generous. The idea about networking is figuring out who could benefit from knowing people, or for that matter, ideas, and making that connection. So to take an example, and not to call you out on this, you, Henning, have done a fabulous job by starting this webinar series. And if you think about it, what have you done? The service that you have provided is you have taken people like Amy Edmondson, who I know well, my friend Bob Sutton, and other people, and you have brought them to tens and hundreds of thousands of people. And in that way, you have done something that has provided a service to your listeners, as well as, by the way, a service to INSEAD and a service to yourself. So basically, all networking is helping people find the resources, including the people who can be helpful to them.
The next rule is, like, we've managed successfully to kind of work on the first 5, just for people to remember. We have get out of your own way. We have break the rules, show up in powerful fashion, create a powerful brand, and network relentlessly. And now we're at a point where we hopefully have some power. And you're pointing this out. Look, use your power. So why is it important? How do you use your power?
Yeah. So Deb Grunfeld, my colleague, who wrote Acting with Power and who has this fabulous YouTube video on acting with power, it talks about many people's ambivalence about power. So many people are promoted into positions of authority or leadership, and they feel ambivalent about it. They don't feel qualified. That goes back to imposter syndrome. Or they don't feel that somehow they deserve to be placed in a position of authority over people who were at one point maybe their peers. You can think about consulting firms where people rise up in the ranks and wind up supervising people that they may have entered the organization with. And she talks about this ambivalence. And because of the ambivalence, people are oftentimes reluctant to exercise their authority. But if I put you in a position, that I'm going to make you Dean of INSEAD tomorrow, you are now, I've given you a set of responsibilities, and I expect you to exercise those responsibilities and to do so with competence and to get things done. And so in order to get things done, you have to use power. That goes back to where we began. And so if you are put in a position of power, to the extent that you actually use that power, you surround your people, you surround yourself with people who can be helpful to you. This is Jim Collins, good to great. Get the right people on the bus. You get the wrong people off the bus. You think about what the strategy should be. You get people energized. You get people organized. You use your power to make things happen. You are going to have more power, not less. It's not going to get used up because people will give you more resources. You will be able to attract more people to your side the more effective you are. So to the extent that you use your power, you will get more power. To the extent that you're put in a position of power and you don't do anything with it, you will soon not have that power.
Jeff, on this topic, and you feature this, I think it is in this chapter, it might be in a different chapter. I have written a paper in the Administrative Science Quarterly on CEO successions, and it's probably the paper I get the most calls up on. Like I have boards calling me, I have CEOs calling me, like how do we manage this CEO succession? And it's a question which has actually popped it up in the Q&A. You refer to the great work by your friend Jeffrey Sonnenfeld on this, in like the different types of kind of CEOs and kind of the legacy they leave behind. I wonder, and you had this beautiful examples where you are on the board and every time you complimented an executive other than the CEO, that executive was quickly gone because the CEO basically made sure that there's no successor available. And that's something I've kind of observed when I've worked with companies on this. I'm very curious, kind of, could you elaborate a little bit, like in a funny way, right? You see, if you manage a succession, you have this odd thing that you have somebody who is very powerful, has become very powerful, is eager to have power, and you need to get out of power. So what has been your experience with that? How do you manage this process?
Well, I think the question really, implicitly or maybe even explicitly hits on something which is extraordinarily important and which we have not yet talked about, which we need to talk about because I see our time is coming to a close. And that is, individual success is not necessarily correlated with organizational success. There are successful organizations in which there are people who are failing. There are people who are successful in organizations that are failing. That what is in the organization's interest and what is in the individual's interest do not always coincide. By the way, measures of organizational success are not always highly correlated with each other. Stock price is not always highly correlated with accounting measures of profit, which is not always highly correlated with measures of market share, et cetera. So you need to be pretty precise in thinking about what your measures of success are and what you're trying to optimize on. I use the example of Stan O'Neill. Stanley O'Neill was the CEO of Merrill Lynch during the 2008 financial crisis, during which Merrill Lynch got into all kinds of financial difficulty and was bought by the Bank of America. Stan O'Neill walked away with a payout of $160 million. And so I will ask my students, was Stan O'Neill successful? If you're Mr. and Mrs. Stanley O'Neill, you are very successful. $160 million is a lot of money. If you're the many thousands of employees at Merrill Lynch who lost their jobs, no, not so successful. So you need to be clear about how to measure success. And organizational success and personal success and organizational performance and individual success are not always correlated. In many cases, they're not correlated at all. And I think the question you pose is a perfect example of this. From the organization's point of view, I am better off as an organization if I have 10 fabulous people competing for the CEO position, each one of whom is perfectly qualified. If I'm one of the competitors, I don't want any competition. because I want to win. So I think that is a good example of where the individual's interests and the organization's interests do not coincide. I have a friend who consulted for many Swiss financial services CEOs, and she said, once you're the CEO, you should look below you and you should understand that most of the people who are reporting to you believe that they're more qualified for the job than you are. In some instances, they will wait. In some instances, they won't. And you see this. You see CEO coups all the time. You see John Reed of Citibank. You see the CEO succession at the Bank of America, which is an example I used in my previous book on power called Power, Why Some People Have It and Others Don't. So yes, life can be interesting in that sense.
It is, you see, it's something I often see. I teach a class on entrepreneurship, and there it's very salient. Heidi Rosen, also a VC in Silicon Valley, and the protagonist of a Stanford GSB case study. She has written a fantastic article how you can build a very successful startup and walk away with nothing. And then on the other hand, so the startup might be successful, but the founder ends up not being successful. And on the other hand, you then have people like Adam Newman, right, who kind of create WeWork, but it's not a profitable company, but he literally walks away as a billionaire, right? So
yes,
it's kind of this
that's a fabulous example of what we're talking about.
Jeff, we are coming towards the end of it. The one rule we haven't talked about is understand that once you have acquired power, what you did to get it will be forgiven, forgotten, or both. And that might be the most controversial thing, right? So say a word about it.
Well, it shouldn't be controversial. People want to be associated with power and success. So once you are powerful and successful, people will make their peace with you and accommodate you. The example I begin the book with is Donald Trump. Many of the never Trumpers, including Senator Lindsey Graham of South Carolina, who called him during the 2016 election all kinds of nasty names, once he was elected president, decided that they actually loved him. And you see this. Trump is, I think, a perfect example of this. But there are many examples. Once someone becomes the dean or the president or the CEO, to the extent that you want to be, your own success is tied to theirs and your own status is tied to their relationship with you, you're going to make peace with them. And the ability for us to rationalize prior behavior is almost infinite. I think nobody remembers the fact that the code on which Microsoft was originally built was actually stolen. And this is not something that, is obscure. You can look this up. I think the Michael Milken, who actually went to jail for some security laws violation, was introduced on a sports broadcast as a kind of a benefactor. So Martha Stewart also went to jail. Her brand has never been more valuable. I'm not suggesting, by the way, that you go to jail. It's a very unpleasant experience, I'm sure. But I think the examples illustrate the fact that once people are powerful and successful, people want to be close to them. The worst or best, depending upon your perspective, example of this is Jeffrey Epstein. Jeffrey Epstein was a convicted sex offender, and members of the British royal family were still hanging out with him. So I'm not telling you to become a sex offender or violate securities laws, but I'm telling you that once you have power and money and success, people will forgive and forget a lot of what you did to get there.
Jeff, you have been on this journey that you've kind of taught and researched power for like 50 years. Any kind of thoughts as we end the podcast? Any kind of insights from that very journey?
No, I would say, first of all, when you introduce 7 Rules of Power, I really like how you did that because I've written a number of books on power. And I'm hoping that each book is better in terms of conveying the ideas more efficiently and also getting people to actually use those ideas. And so I hope 7 Rules is, in fact, a step forward in that direction. And thank you for the nice words you said about it. And, I think, so I was out to lunch with a friend of mine one day who was a partner at Venrock, a venture capital firm. And we were talking about something. And he looked at me, he said, "You're an academic." And I looked at him and he said, "That's not an insult, that's a description." And I think that's true. I mean, to me, I've had the privilege of being in this journey in which I can explore my intellectual curiosity. At the moment, I'm writing a book about healthcare in the United States. And I'm doing research in the healthcare domain. You know, I've had the privilege of doing what interests me. And then I've had the privilege of knowing through my association with Stanford and elsewhere, all these amazing people. And it's really been a fabulously fantastic privilege for me. And it's been a fantastically fabulous privilege for me to be part of this webinar series and be able to have this enormous audience and talk to them, you know, about power.
Jeff, thank you so much. This has been fantastic. I have followed this for a long time. Your staying power has also showed in this webinar. We still have almost like 1,000 people with us. Thank you so much. I will make the recording available in the not too far future. As the next guest for the webinar, we actually have Markus Reitzig. Markus Reitzig is a professor in Vienna, and he's talking about a topic which is actually quite related, I would say, to what we are talking about today. He's actually talking about flat organizations and how you can get them to work and how you succeed in them. So if you're actually interested in this topic and think about organizations, you should actually join for the next webinar with Markus Reitzig, who really kind of does a deep dive. I've put the link into the chat notes. So I hope you join for Markus Reitzig. He's an incredibly smart German academic who now teaches in Austria and who has thought for 20, 30 years about how to get organizations to work. So highly related to what we talked about today. Jeff, thank you so much. I'll make the recording available, including the links to the various people you've talked about. Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity. Be well. Bye.
Bye.